Let me welcome you all to the 12th Annual Montana Alumni Association Community Lecture Series. I wonder how many of you have attended these series before? Put your hand up. See, they're all veterans, Nat. They're all veterans. They keep coming back in the bleak midwinter, you know, as we say. Thank you all for coming. We're really excited about this year's lecture series. I was going to explain to you how we come up with the theme and the faculty every year, but I hardly think I need to do that since almost all of you are returning students. Just briefly, we get together, our heads of the advisory council, and we come up with a group of really wonderful faculty people, and then we kind of look around to try to come up with some kind of a theme, and then we see whether those people are willing to work with the theme. And I think it's been a really good run thus far. So thanks to everybody who's on the advisory council who is here. Can you raise your hands if you're here? Don Hobby's here, and Milena's in the back. She's here. Is that it for tonight? They'll be filtering in to the other lectures, I'm sure. So I don't want to take too much time. Just welcome. This lecture series, as you know, is called The Power to Move. It would amaze you how long it takes us to come up with a title for these series. I mean, it's really sort of the hardest thing of all. The Power to Move, the books and art that changed our lives. And to some extent, I think this is not only our lives as a society, but the lives of the lecturers, because they always get a chance to choose their topic and find something that they think is important and something that's been important to them in their work. I'm going to introduce Professor Levtow in just a minute, but let me first of all remind you to turn off your cell phones, please. Usually I forget. So, secondly, let me remind you that there will be the traditional wine and cheese after the last lecture. So be sure to be here and join us for that. It's always fun to have all of the lecturers together, and also to point out again that, as usual, although not always, MCAT is taping the lecture series, so you'll be able to see that. I don't have the schedule yet, but I can probably get the schedule for you before the series is over. So thank you very, very much for being here. And I'm really pleased that I have the chance to introduce my colleague, Nathaniel Levtow. Professor Levtow is a member of the Faculty of Liberal Studies and Religious Studies. And Religious Studies, as some of you may remember, used to be a department on its own and then disappeared a few decades ago from our curriculum, and now is back just in this year, and I think there's a lot of interest among students. Professor Levtow's classes are very well attended and very well enrolled, and he's got a wonderful reputation on campus. So he teaches a whole range of courses in religious studies. He comes to us by way of Brown University, where he received his PhD, and also Harvard Divinity School, where he received his master's in theological studies. His specialty is the Hellenistic period, kind of that last period of Greek culture that blends into Christianity somewhere along the way, and Judaism in that period, and early Christianity. So it's a very wonderful palette of specialties for us, and I look forward to his talk tonight. He came to us in the university faculty only in 2006, so he's a relative newcomer. I'm not sure exactly of the 6 lecturers in this series how long the longest tenure is here thus far, but I think they're all relative newcomers, and they're a really wonderful group. Professor Levtow has been at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and was also a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. So you see, we're very, very lucky to have him. He's studied far and wide, and he's now here to tell us what he's found out. I want to let you know that I've never been in one of Professor Levtow's classes, but my own son, Robert, was sucked into religious studies by just one class from Professor Levtow. You know him, Melanie. You'll know Robbie, right? So in any case, I feel just wonderful being able to introduce him to you. I don't want to take too long. As all of you know, the lecture is approximately 50 minutes long, and then there will be plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. So with that, let me just present Professor Nathaniel Levtow.
Thank you very much for your very gracious introduction, Professor Jillison, and thank you all for being here on a cold and somewhat rainy night when you could otherwise be warm at home watching the Olympics. I hope to make the evening worthwhile by spending the next 50 minutes or so taking you all on a bit of a literary tour through the ancient world and the book of books. As Professor Jillison had noted, I came to Missoula by way of Edinburgh, Scotland, and that is a city with a very rich literary history, and I really enjoyed taking literary tours where I could go see, say, the homes of David Hume or Adam Smith, or see where Arthur Conan Doyle would have a drink, or Robert Louis Stevenson. And what I'd like to do here is offer a similar literary tour, although unfortunately without the opportunity to stop in now and again to a pub. Oh, by the way, when I told my friends I was coming to Missoula, my Scottish friends, that one of them had been here before, and he said, "You are going from the Highlands to the Ultra Highlands." So, the literary tour I would like to move us all along will cover a range of landscapes, both geographic or cultural, and also literary. So literary and geographic landscapes. So a literary tour of the ancient world and the book of books. By the ancient world, generally speaking, I mean the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, roughly between 1200 BCE and 400 CE. All told, that is the general time frame and geographical region during which and within which the Bible, both the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, were composed and put together into books. It's a rather large period of time and a large region, and so what I'll do is offer somewhat of a bird's eye view, occasionally perching over interesting landscapes, and I look forward to the question and answer period afterwards, where I do encourage you to feel free to ask any questions you like about what I've discussed or anything else. Okay. So, the book of books is called the Bible. Now, the Bible is from a Greek word, ta biblia, meaning literally the books. And so we have to ask which books. This is, in other words, not just a book, but a book that is a collection of books. And the books that are within that collection we call the canon. What is a canon? A canon is an authoritative collection of books and also a traditional order of those books. And so there are a number of different yet somewhat similar biblical canons. Judaism and Christianity both share what we will call the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. With respect to the Jewish canon, that is the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament, and it is exactly the same as the Protestant Old Testament. And for Judaism and for Protestantism, it is the same for all denominations. However, with the case of other variations, varieties, forms of traditions of Christianity, we have a slightly different canon and a much more expanded canon. We have the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and there are some differences between the Protestant canon, the Roman Catholic canon, the Greek Orthodox canon, the Eastern Syriac canon, and the Ethiopian canon. When we talk about the whole enchilada, both the Hebrew Bible plus the New Testament, we can see within it three layers or three stages. The first being the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, the last being the New Testament, and in between there are a range of other books. Those books are often called the Apocrypha or deuterocanonical books. What is the Apocrypha? Those are books that were included in the Roman Catholic canon or the Eastern Orthodox canon, but not in the Protestant canon. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And I know this is a little hard to see, but yeah, in a nutshell, what we've got, we have three columns. So we have the Jewish canon, the Protestant canon, and the Roman, Greek, and Russian canons. Now, this is just with respect to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And you'll see that the Jewish and Protestant canons are the same, although there is a slightly different order of books. In the case of the Roman, Greek, and Russian canons, you'll see, or I can point to, some titles of books that are in italics. Those are books that are included in the Bibles of the Roman, Greek, and Russian churches, but not in the Protestant churches. And so you'll notice also that they all begin with the same first 5 books. That's what we call the Pentateuch. In other words, 5 books, also called the Torah. And then we have a number of historical books. And then there are a range of differences in terms of the collections of books and the order of those books. So, how did this book come to be? Generally speaking, what I'd like to do is take us all on a literary tour first of the making of the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, and then the making of the New Testament. And in between, I'll say a few words about that literature that is called deuterocanonical, or apocryphal. So first, geographically speaking, with respect to both testaments, the region we will be focusing on, the region out of which these books emerged, we call the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world during that period of time. And the way to think about this world is, and specifically the focal region for biblical literature, which is, you can see right here in the Eastern Mediterranean, you see that right there, Jerusalem. This was very much a crossroads of the first world empires, beginning with the Egyptian expansion in the 2nd millennium north, and then primarily with the cultures of Mesopotamia expanding west. First Assyria, then Babylonia, then Persia, and then from the west back to the east, Greece and Rome. In other words, how do you get from, say, Asia or Europe to Africa? You have to go through this land, the land of the Bible. And therefore, what we have in biblical literature is a reflection of this very rich cultural amalgam, both with respect to languages, ideas about God, about people, about the world. It is truly a book of books composed by a number of different cultures, a number of different peoples who interacted with most of the world cultures of that time. And so there's going to be a great variety both with respect to authorship and readership and perspective for the biblical texts. All right, so first let's talk about the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament. Without going into too much detail, and don't worry, it won't be on the exam, many cultures might have, or many religions might have their holy books as, say, lists of doctrine or ritual prescriptions. Interestingly, biblical literature, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, is very historically oriented, and there is what we would call a biblical narrative. It begins in Genesis and ends in the 2nd book of Kings. And broadly speaking, it tells the story from the creation of the world to the creation of Israel, which I'll talk about in a bit, and ultimately to the destruction of Jerusalem and Israel in 586 BCE. Now, I mentioned that the first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch. These are often considered the most authoritative and foundational biblical books, and also they are very complex with respect to authorship. Now, traditionally, you may have heard the term the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of Moses. Traditionally, it is accepted that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Now, why would this view, Upon what is this view based? Well, upon a couple of different hints within the biblical texts themselves. For example, the book of Deuteronomy is presented as a monologue by Moses on the plains just east of the River Jordan, right before he hands the baton to Joshua, who then enters the Holy Land. Similarly, Moses is the one in the biblical narrative who receives the revelation at Mount Sinai, that great block of legal and ritual, religious material that we find in the books of the second half of Exodus, then Leviticus, then Numbers. And so there is a great tradition whereby Moses is understood to have written the Pentateuch. Therefore, we have the phrase, the 5 books of Moses. Mentioning that's Sinai, a very beautiful landscape. I've spent some time there. In fact, there is a site that is traditionally Mount Sinai. We generally identify that as the region associated with the traditions in the Bible about Mount Sinai. Unfortunately, I was a little unsure, and I climbed up the wrong mountain. And it was at night, and I had a candle. And I reached the top, and all I found was a cave with a skull and crossbones. And I realized I had gone up the wrong mountain. I had to go up there. It was the middle of the night. It was a problem. But it's a very beautiful region, the Sinai. Also, sometimes Moses is represented in the Pentateuch as a writer. For example, in the book of Exodus, chapter 17, verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a reminder in a book and recite it in the hearing of Joshua." Now, what this is not specified in that passage. In fact, it's actually just a specific injunction for Moses, and as far as how Israel must relate to a particular other people called the Amalekites. Not important for now, not going to be in the exam, but just to note that even though Moses in the biblical narrative is instructed to write something in a book, it does not specify what that book is. Similarly, in Deuteronomy 31:9, then Moses wrote down this Torah and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. What is Torah? Well, the Hebrew term Torah simply means teaching. Later, many years later, after the Bible was written, it came to mean the Torah, at first the book of Deuteronomy, and then the Pentateuch. Ultimately, it came to mean the entire Hebrew Bible, the Torah. But in this specific setting, it simply means teaching. Moses wrote down this teaching. And so what that seems to refer to is simply the specific teaching that appears in that chapter of Deuteronomy. It does not specifically say that this was, Moses wrote down the Pentateuch. But again, this is some evidence why later tradition ascribed the composition of the Pentateuch to Moses. Now, there's some evidence for other authorship too. For example, at the very end of Deuteronomy, we read the following in Deuteronomy 34. Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab. At the Lord's command, he was buried in a valley in the land of Moab opposite Beit Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. A very famous verse that we find all over the place, actually, in the Pentateuch and in the historical books to this day. Now, Moses clearly was an extremely powerful and impressive person, but here is something that would be quite a challenge to do, and you see that it refers to Moses' death in the third person. Similarly, right at the beginning, in Genesis 12:6, we have an interesting little phrase just stuck right into the chapter, which says, "At that time, the Canaanites were in the land." Now, what time would that be? At that time, the Canaanites, who were the Canaanites? The Canaanites were the pre-Israelite inhabitants of the Holy Land. And so the Canaanites were not dislodged from the Holy Land until after Joshua arrived, after Moses. And so even in the Middle Ages, biblical scholars noted that, in fact, one famous biblical scholar said that a great secret lies here. But then he quoted a book of Amos, the book of Amos, saying, "The wise will remain silent because it is an evil time." Meaning that were he to say that there is an indication here that Moses might not have written this, because this was written by someone who lived after the Canaanites were dislodged, well, they might get in trouble. And indeed, hundreds of years after that scholar lived, Galileo was almost burned at the stake for saying that there were moons to Jupiter. So it wasn't really until the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries where other arguments for authorship were proposed. Now, one other problematic aspect of Mosaic authorship is that the alphabet was not invented in the time during which the narrative stories about Moses were composed. This is an early alphabetic inscription, interestingly, from the Egypt-Sinai area from the late 2nd millennium. If you go by the internal chronology of the Bible itself, the time of Moses is pre-alphabetic. Now, you might say that there could have been oral traditions that were later written down, and many people make that argument. Although, ironically, arguments about oral sources are always necessarily arguments from silence when we speak of the ancient world. The 5 books of Moses is something actually that is nowhere in the 5 books of the Pentateuch, but rather the first time we encounter this phrase, the earliest reference to it, is actually in the 1st century in a book by Josephus, a 1st century CE Jewish historian. Later on, therefore, it became dogma in the Middle Ages. But certainly when the Bible was being written, and even throughout the entire ancient period at the time of the beginnings of Judaism and Christianity, it was not a universal precept or dogma that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. It was not. So therefore, who did? Who did? Well, one brief point about method, and it's very important to remember. We need to distinguish between canonical order and chronological order. Or, in other words, when a biblical book is set and when it was written. Just because a biblical book tells a narrative about Joshua's conquest of Canaan does not mean that that book was written during the time of Joshua's conquest of Canaan. Similarly, Genesis 1, the canonical order, according to the canonical order, the first book, is actually quite late. It was one of the latest books in the Bible. So we need to distinguish between when a book was written and the time during which it was set, and also distinguish between where a biblical text appears in the canon, and again, when it might have been written. And that makes sense. The later authors would have had the last say, and of course, they would have put their words first. And in general, when we speak of early traditions of ancient Israel, for example, the kind of history that we read in the books of Genesis and Exodus, about the wanderings in the wilderness and even the conquest of Canaan, this is from what we might call a prehistoric or at least pre-alphabetic period. Then again, set in earlier times, but written in later times. More specifically, written in the 1st millennium BCE. Let me talk a little bit more about that. In a nutshell, who wrote the Hebrew Bible? Israelites did. Who were Israelites? Israelites were a people of somewhat obscure origin that flourished in the eastern Mediterranean seaboard, in the central highlands, right here, roughly during the time period between 1200 BCE and 600 or the mid 6th century BCE. That is to say, roughly speaking, the first half of the 1st millennium BCE. Now, again, this isn't going to be on the test, but let me just point to a couple of highlights about the people Israel. They emerged obscurely. We don't know where. There are many theories. But we do know that somewhere around the 10th century, a group of tribes that had similar language, a similar religion, a similar culture, cohered under what became a kingdom, not the United Kingdom, despite what I said about Scotland, but the united monarchy, namely of David and Solomon. That's really where we can be sure by that time that there was a people Israel, a kingdom of Israel, and the possibility of writing the history of these people. Shortly after David and Solomon, in fact right after Solomon, Like America, they had a civil war. Unlike America, their civil war lasted for centuries. And for 2 centuries, you had a north and a south. It's a little confusing, but the north was called Israel, the kingdom of Israel. The south was called Judah. The north was conquered by Assyria in 722 BCE, never to appear again. They were exiled to ancient Iran. Ancient Iranians were relocated to northern Israel. They ultimately became a people that you may have heard of, the Samaritans. That's the origin of the Samaritans. And then for another 150 or so years, you had then the kingdom of Judah alone. One interesting moment in between that time was in the year 701, when the kingdom of Assyria continued its conquest of the east and the west, and then conquered every city of Judah, and would have conquered Jerusalem were it not for the fact that the Assyrian king had to return home to quell a coup that fomented in his absence by his sons, and ultimately, in fact, his sons did kill him. Had Assyria conquered Jerusalem, I assure you this talk today would look very different. We probably would not have a Bible, and definitely not a Bible as we know it. But in fact, the kingdom of Judah did survive, barely, and the fact that it survived gave great confidence to the people of Jerusalem, that somehow there was something special about this place and this people and this one God that could protect them against a power that no one else could defend themselves against. Ultimately, however, Judah also fell, not to Assyria, but to Babylon in 586. That's the most significant event in the Hebrew Bible. It impacted everything. Much of the Bible was written in response to that event. Looking ahead, I'll get to this later period in a little bit. I just want to focus on this earlier period, roughly the first half of the first millennium. That's the time when the kingdoms of ancient Israel and Judah flourished, and much of biblical literature was composed. Just an historical aside, I am sometimes a historian, a cultural historian. What we need to do when we want to ask questions about the history of ancient Israel is distinguish between what we read in the Bible and any other what we call extra-biblical evidence. We like to have as many sides as we can for this picture. And interestingly, fortunately, unfortunately, we really only have very little evidence for the existence of Israel outside of the Hebrew Bible. The earliest piece of evidence is on an inscription. A stela is like a stone, standing stone with writing on it, by an Egyptian pharaoh from roughly the late 13th century that mentions, for the first time outside of the Bible, a people, Israel. It says nothing, by the way, about an exodus. All it says is that I, Merneptah, conquered everyone. I conquered the people Israel. Literally, her seed is not. That's all we have. That's the earliest reference to Israel. A very nice reference that we get closer to home is this was actually an inscription discovered in 1993 from an ancient site in the north, just on the border of present-day Lebanon and Israel, in a site called Dan. And we found a stone inscription that mentions the house of David. This is very important because, believe it or not, there are a lot of people who argue that the kingdom of David is a fiction, that David never existed. It is all a literary fiction by later writers. And here we have a nice piece of evidence that there was a kingdom of David. House can mean dynasty, and this is referring to a dynasty of David. It was not written by Israelites, it was written by one of their enemies. And so this is a nice little historical peg upon which we can hang a nice clear piece of evidence for the existence of the Davidic dynasty. And this was in the 9th century. The kingdom of David and Solomon flourished then over the course of the 10th century, and you could see, generally speaking, the the area. We can see there the Dead Sea, and then the River Jordan, and then the Galilee, and you could see it was on both the east and west side. Notice they never conquered all of the coast, and that eventually all of the coast of both the north and the south. Geologically, this area of the Kingdom of Israel is one of the most diverse geologic regions on Earth. My parents lived in New Mexico for a while. I don't know if you've ever been there, but you have in the south desert, and then in the middle you have scrub, and in the north you have mountains and rivers like Colorado. Israel is very much like that. We have desert in the south, very, very harsh desert. And then in the middle, we have kind of dry grass. This is, generally speaking, the area where Jerusalem is. This is the River Jordan, sadly slowing down to a trickle as more and more of its water is being diverted for agriculture. The sources of the Jordan would be the Sea of Galilee in the north. And in the central highlands, we have the city of Jerusalem. Now, this is the modern-day city of Jerusalem, but like any city in the ancient, in the modern Middle East, you have a modern city surrounding an old city, and in the middle of the old city, you have what's called the Temple Mount. And what is that? Well, that was the center of the world for the people of Israel. It was where their king lived, and it was where their God lived. And right next to the king's palace, you had the God's temple. The God of Israel, his name was Yahweh, and like every other ancient Near Eastern culture, this people had one major deity to whom they ascribed all of their security and power to. And we have no archaeological remains, by the way, for the original temple of Solomon. That temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586. It was rebuilt and then later destroyed by the Romans. That second temple, we do have some archaeological remains, and you can see some excavations here and here. All of this is medieval, and you can see that Islam also roots its traditions in the land of Israel as well. And you have here the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Dome of the Rock is the site, according to Islamic tradition, where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac. So modern day, Old City, Temple Mount, New City of Jerusalem. This is generally a reconstruction of the Jerusalem temple. Typical of temples in the ancient Near East, you had an outer region, and you had an area where sacrifices were performed, and then you had the inner sanctum where the deity was understood to reside. All right, back to writing and who wrote the Bible. Generally speaking, who wrote the Bible? Scribes did. Who were scribes? Scribes were a professional cast of specialists who were trained to inscribe words upon stones and upon scrolls. Not everyone could do this. Very few people could read, and even fewer people could write. And so when we ask who wrote the Bible, we need to complexify our understanding of authorship. Authorship in the ancient world was very different from authorship in the modern world. When we're talking about a particular book and who wrote it, we must think in terms of schools of hundreds of anonymous scribes working over centuries. Working where? In either the palace workshops or the temple workshops. And you always had the king's palace and the God's temple right next to each other. And you had these literary specialists training and working in each site. Now, authors were also editors. That is to say, the creation of books in the ancient world was both a very conservative and a very creative process. It was not the case that an individual could sit in a room alone, a room with a view, and write a book like Genesis. that was not the case. What would happen is more of, you could think of it as a snowball effect, where you might begin with a very, maybe a cultural memory of, say, an Exodus that eventually was written down as a poem or a short piece of prose, and then was added to over centuries, where new scribes would take old traditions and add new things to them, but not to create an alternative story or an alternative text, but rather to add to the text itself. And so again, it's the idea of a snowball. Or another way, this was found actually just a few years ago. This is a scribal exercise. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little alphabet right there. And you can see it. We found that in a site near Jerusalem. It's from the 10th century, maybe by a scribe associated with the kingdom of Solomon or David. And it is just a little, like a school exercise on how to write an alphabet. Very interesting. One way I suggest my students think of a biblical text is to think of it like a tell. What is a tell? A tell is an ancient site. Now, if you came across this site, this is actually the site where that little scribal exercise was found, you would see a very pretty hill in springtime, but a trained archaeologist would see something else. They would say, this is not just a hill, this is a site of habitation. And typically, sites of settlement were there for a reason, either because they were easily defended, or because there was a dependable source of water nearby. And so what you would have would be successive layers of habitation over centuries. Different cities being built, maybe destroyed by an earthquake or an enemy, and then rebuilt over the same site, layers. This is the same hill, just in a different time of year. And you could see that the further down you go, the older you get in terms of a civilization. So you have different layers of different periods of habitation. And a biblical text is very much like that. It's a little harder to unravel. But similarly, you have layers of scribal activity. So in the book of Genesis, who wrote the book of Genesis? Hundreds of different people over hundreds of years. And the work of biblical scholarship often comes down to trying to determine which text was written by which group of authors when. It's not an easy task, but it's also a very interesting task. By the way, I identify myself more as a text scholar. When we talk about the field of biblical studies, there are people who focus on text, and there are also archaeologists. I often envy my archaeologist colleagues because they get to discover genuinely new things like that scribal exercise, whereas what we do is try and find new ways of looking at old things. So I have my colleague in Bozeman at MSU, she is an archaeologist. I joined her on one of her digs. Of course, all I found after digging in the boiling sun for weeks and weeks was scorpions after scorpion after scorpion. And I said, that's enough for me. Of course, the next year they went back and found a Bronze Age burial tomb. And I was like, oh. So, all right. What were the moments when, in the history of ancient Israel, during which scribal activity flourished? Well, one period seems to have been during the time of David and Solomon, when there was a strong, prosperous, stable kingdom, united kingdom. Another moment seems to have been in the 7th century, where there was another great king, lesser known, but for our biblical writers, actually more important even than David and Solomon, and his name was Josiah. Josiah was our biblical historian's favorite king. And we find in the history of the king of Josiah's reign an interesting story. Josiah orders his secretaries to go to the temple where they had, because there were scribes there, archives, and they come back and they say, we found a book. And this was a lost book. And so what they say to the king is, I have found a book of Torah, a book of teaching in the temple of the Lord, or a book of the law in the temple of the Lord. And what happens is that the King Josiah takes this book, reads it, weeps, tears his clothes in a sign of ritual mourning, and then reads the book to the people and embarks then upon a great series of religious reforms according to what that book instructs. Now, what was that book? It seems to have been an early form of the book of Deuteronomy. Because when you see what Josiah then does, what he does is essentially try and enact in the landscape of Judah the ritual and religious and social map that we see in the book of Deuteronomy. He tries to actualize that in the land itself. And so what the king does is he read in the hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the temple of the Lord. This is a reference to the same book. Here it's called the book of the covenant. A covenant is perhaps the most foundational idea in the Hebrew Bible. It is a binding contract, an agreement. It is a book about the relationship between human beings and between the people of Israel and the God of Israel. Again, seemingly referring here to the book of Deuteronomy. And if you're looking for the earliest moment when a biblical text or a proto-biblical text was taken and read to a people publicly, this would be it, the first time in our biblical record. Another very important moment in the history of the creation of the Bible, according to our evidence in the Bible itself, occurs in the 5th century. Now, in the 7th century, what I described with respect to King Josiah, this seems to have been a period where books were actually written. Even though he says, I found a book that was already written, this was a time when many other biblical books were being written, and it seems that the book of Deuteronomy itself was being composed as well. If you skip ahead a couple hundred years, after the destruction of the kingdom, what we have is a transformation from the process of composition of texts to the beginning of the process of the canonization of texts. In other words, in the Israelite period, we have biblical books being written. But after the destruction of the kingdom of Israel, we have books that have been already written now being edited and canonized and authorized. People saying, all right, of all these writings, these are the ones that we must base our scripture on. This is the beginning of scripture. And what we read about in a late biblical book is a text about a very famous scribe named Ezra, who was part of the group of exiles after the conquest of Jerusalem by Babylon, who had then returned from Babylon back to Jerusalem to reconstruct and reconstitute the land and the people. And what he does is this, and I'll just read this quote. They told the scribe Ezra to bring the book of the Torah of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. And so they read from the book, from the Torah of God, with interpretation. In other words, what is this event depicting? What we're seeing here is a people that had been destroyed by Babylonia now being reconstructed. And the way they describe this reconstruction is through the public reading of a book that had already been written. And the interesting thing here is that he not only reads the book to the people, but he reads it with interpretation. In other words, if you're looking for a moment, the first time when a biblical book is not simply read, or a proto-biblical book is not simply read, but actually explained what it means in history, this would be it. This would be the first account, the earliest account of a biblical text being read to a people and also explained, interpreted. And this happens in that second stage. After the book is composed in the Israelite period, now we have the book being canonized and now interpreted. And one other moment in the history of the making of the Hebrew Bible that I'd point out, based on the evidence within the Bible itself, is from an interesting ancient Jewish text written, it seems, in the 2nd century BCE, in the Greek age. And this is a book called The Wisdom of Ben Sirach, or Sirach. And the prologue to that book reads, "Many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the other writings that followed them." Now, what is significant about this? This is the first indication, the earliest indication of what later becomes the tripartite structure of the Old Testament. Torah, prophets, Torah or law, prophets, and then writings. Remember back in that canon, the very kind of small canon table there, the division of all of the Hebrew biblical books into 3, the Pentateuch, prophets, and writings, seems to have begun in the Greek age. In other words, what we have is now not simply biblical books already composed, but now also canonized, and now that canon is being structured in particular ways. In this case, the way that ultimately gains authority and standardization, the tripartite structure, the Pentateuch, prophets, and then the writings. Pentateuch, first 5 books, prophets, prophetic books, writings, everything else. So in other words, to step back, if you're trying to get a bird's eye view of the composition of the Hebrew Bible, we can say the following. It was written by Israelites in the first half of the first millennium BCE, and then edited and canonized by Jews in the second half of the first millennium BCE. The evidence suggests that the first 5 books were edited and canonized first, the Pentateuch, then the prophetic books, and lastly, the writings. And even through the time of Jesus, that third category, the writings, was still quite fluid. And you'll notice I distinguish between Israelites and Jews. I do that only because what I try to do is describe the ancients as they describe themselves. And in the Hebrew Bible itself, they describe themselves as Israelites. You don't really see the word Jew until what we could call the post-biblical period, or that moment in the second half of the first millennium. And that's a longer story, which I'd be happy to discuss in the question and answer period. Let me pause for a second and mention a few things about prophets. Very, very important. This is the prophet Jeremiah at the temple, a prefiguration for our New Testament authors for what Jesus does. In fact, Jesus quotes Jeremiah, who actually quotes another prophet, Micah, in going to the temple and challenging its leadership. What is prophecy? Well, in a nutshell, a prophet was a human being, could be a man or a woman, who was understood to speak not their own words, but the words of a god or a goddess. And prophets spoke, they didn't write. The phenomena of prophetic books, prophets having their words written down, occurs only after the age when prophecy kind of dies out. It seems that prophets rise and fall with kings. Prophets and kings are always related. In fact, a king couldn't become a king unless a prophet could anoint that king through the words of the God that prophet spoke for. The phenomena of written prophecy is very significant, because if you think about it, as I said, what did a prophet do? A prophet spoke the holy words of a god or a goddess. That which a prophet said was holy. It was of a god. And so if you write those words down, suddenly what do you have? You have Holy Writ, written words that are directly from a deity. This is a new thing. This was an innovation. It happened in ancient Israel, and it happened in the late 6th century, at the beginning of the late 6th century BCE. If you're looking for the origins of the idea of a revealed book, a holy book, it happens when prophecy is understood to be written down. Because again, the words of a prophet are holy, are a revelation, are directly from a deity. Let me pause also and say a few words about a fantastic discovery in the mid-20th century. You might have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Why are the Dead Sea Scrolls significant with respect to the Bible? Well, what were the Dead Sea Scrolls? They were, think of them as a library found on the shores of the Dead Sea in a place called Khirbet Qumran. Therefore, we call it the Qumran Scrolls as well. And they were, this was a collection of books belonging to a group of Jews who seem to have removed themselves from Jerusalem, gone to a very harsh area in the Dead Sea, and collected and wrote manuscripts that range from around the 250 BCE to 70. They, like so many other Jewish groups at that time, disappeared at the time of the Roman conquest of Judea. And why are the Dead Sea Scrolls significant? Well, we find two types of literature in the Qumran library. One, literature written by these people themselves, new stuff we never knew about. And then two, biblical manuscripts, actual biblical handwritten texts like Exodus or Genesis or Samuel that were fully 1,000 years older than the biblical manuscripts that we have had until before the Dead Sea Scrolls. We had, I think, among the oldest ones, manuscripts would have been what's called the Leningrad Codex, for example. That's from around 1000 of our era, 1000 CE. So this was this is some very early evidence of biblical texts. And what do we find? Well, we found a few very interesting things. First, we find evidence of what the canon, the biblical canon, the Hebrew biblical canon looked like at that time, roughly around the 1st century CE, the 1st century BCE. And we see there a Torah, a Pentateuch, that looks much like the one we know. Similarly, the prophets, much like the ones we know. We also find a number of other writings, but there's a little more fluidity there. They seem to, again, reflect the stage in the canon where you had, remember that tripartite division, Torah, prophets, writings. The Torah was set by then, the prophets pretty much set by then. And the writings, there were some differences. Some were there, some were not. Some might have been considered scripture, some might not have been. It's unclear. And then, of course, a range of other books, including new books that we had never known about. And we could think if they had survived and put together their own Bible, it would have included some of those other books as well. And the other very interesting point is that we see something that we didn't expect in the Qumran biblical manuscripts. Namely, that they were tolerant of what is called a pluriform text. What do I mean by that? I mean that we find there two different versions, for example, of the book of Jeremiah. Similar and yet very different. One might say have a poem from, say, Jeremiah 10, chapter 10, that is half as long as the one we know. And they have also the one we know, and that was okay with them. They were okay with the fact that a biblical text was an organic product that was not yet frozen. Even though we have evidence of a developing canon, that didn't mean that they couldn't have two different forms of that canon. That was okay with them. They kept two. Both were sacred, it seems, to them. Similarly, they seem to have viewed with great authority the book of Jubilees. What is Jubilees? It's a late Greek Jewish retelling of the book of Genesis. It's not that it replaced Genesis, it just meant that they could have two of them together. In other words, a pluriform text, many forms. What does this mean? If you want to find the original Bible, you're not going to, because there are different original Bibles. And there's something called a critical edition. What is a critical edition? If you go to the bookstore and you get a Bible, what are you going to find? You're going to find, say, an English translation of, in this case, in the Hebrew Bible, an originally Hebrew text. But which Hebrew text? Well, that's the decision usually of modern European, American scholars who sit down with all these different manuscripts and try and decide which is the best one, or maybe how to combine all of them. These are decisions made by human beings today. And after the Dead Sea Scrolls, it really has revolutionized our idea of the origins of the Bible, because it undermined, it challenged that whole notion that there was an original text in the first place. And what a critical edition actually should look like, well, let's take the book of Genesis. It should have maybe 4 columns, each with, say, a different manuscript tradition of Genesis 1. There won't be huge differences. In some cases, there will be large differences. In the case of Genesis 1, there won't be huge differences. But still, there's not going to be one manuscript tradition that's going to be, say, more original than another. And the people of Qumran, the people of, say, Jesus' day, would have been okay with that. It's very interesting. And that was a truly revolutionary discovery. Dead Sea Scrolls. That's the Dead Sea area, the Judean desert, a very harsh and very beautiful region. Just around 10-minute drive, very steeply downhill from Jerusalem. This is a fragment of the great, or a part of the great Isaiah scroll from Qumran. This is just one piece of it. You can see that they wrote in Hebrew from right to left, counted backwards then too, and you can see that they divide between words. That's something that Greek New Testament manuscripts don't do, by the way. Can you imagine trying to decipher an ancient Greek text that doesn't even, forget about chapter and verse, not even words, you know? Think how, what has to go into even reading what's on the page, let alone, forget about interpreting what it means. Okay, so let me say just a few words about some other books. Other books written by Jews in the second half of the second millennium that were not included in the Jewish canon and not included in the Protestant Old Testament canon, but that were nevertheless preserved by early Christians and included in the other canons, the Roman, Greek, Russian, Ethiopian Old Testaments. That's that collection of literature that is often called the Apocrypha, literally the outside writings, also sometimes known as the Pseudepigrapha, literally false writings. Why is it false? Because what they say is false? No, simply because, as I indicated, ancient authorship was very different from modern authorship, and that included an anonymous authorship. And what would often happen is books were ascribed to famous authoritative people. So you have, say, books written in Greek that would be attributed to, say, Abraham. There's a book called The Testament of Abraham. It's like his last will and testament. Written by Abraham? No, couldn't have been written by Abraham, but nevertheless attributed to Abraham. What were these all? These are Jewish writings of the second half of the second millennium that were preserved by early Christians and canonized by some. That book, Jubilees, that I mentioned, that's one of them. That's in the Ethiopian canon. And there are many, many other books. If you go to the library, you can check out a book called the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, 2 volumes like that thick, or Old Testament Apocrypha, and you'll see many, 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 hundreds of pages of ancient Jewish writings that were not canonized in Jewish traditions or in Protestant traditions, but by the other Roman, Greek, Russian, and Ethiopian traditions as well. So, what would have been the scriptures of the first Christians? In other words, what did the Hebrew biblical canon look like in the first century of our era? Well, they would have had a Pentateuch, just like the Qumran community did. Similarly, they would have had a group of prophetic books that would have looked just much like what we have. And then they would have had also a range of other writings, the status and number of which varied, depending on which group of people you're talking about, where you are in Egypt and in Syria, Palestine, in Rome. It really depended. So if you compare, say, what we see from a similar a community at a similar time and place, the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it would have been a very similar picture. Again, same Pentateuch, or more or less same Pentateuch, similar prophets, and then a variety of other ancient Jewish writings that they would have preserved, and then some distinctive new writings. That's what I want to now move on to, the new writings. And one last point, we are not talking about books yet, we are talking about scrolls, collections of scrolls. And that's important with respect to, if you think about the formation of the Bible as a book. We're not quite there yet. So we're talking about individual scrolls, say a scroll of Isaiah made of animal skin or papyrus. And so this was a very significant aspect of the making of the Bible. We're not quite at the stage where books are bound. We are talking about individual scrolls. So now let me say a few words now about the possibility of new scriptures. And with this, we enter into the world of the first Christians. When you look at Christian writings from the first 2 centuries of our era, this reflects, broadly speaking, developments of movement that began among Jews in first century Judea, and that eventually and quite quickly actually spread throughout the Greco-Roman world. We're talking about many different communities made up of many different people with many different ideas, and of course that was reflected in the different writings of these peoples. Not all of the writings of the first Christians were, of course, included in the New Testament, just like not all ancient Israelite and early Jewish writings were included in the Old Testament. Let me say a few words about the cultural, historical landscape of the world of the first Christians, namely the people in the followers of Jesus in first century Judea. Judea, roughly speaking, the same region as the Kingdom of Judah in the Eastern Mediterranean, with Jerusalem at its center, was by the first century an Eastern Roman province. It was the heartland of ancient Judaism, culturally dominated by Greece, politically dominated by Rome. That's why the New Testament tells us about Roman authorities and Jewish individuals in scriptures and temples, and is written in Greek. Roughly speaking, here's a Roman empire, in the first century, the time of Augustus, roughly the time of the birth of Jesus and Paul. And this is our eastern province of Judea, Palestina. Romans, of course, are known for building roads. Here's a Roman road. Literally, this is a Roman road to Damascus, if you know your Paul. You can see some some car tires. I don't think that was there. Let me give you a bird's eye view of the literary landscape of the New Testament, the canon, the canonized. Remember, these were not the only writings of the first Christians, but these were the ones that ultimately were canonized. 27 new texts. 4 of them are called Gospels. Gospels, literally that word means God spell. Middle English, God is good, spell news, good news. From the Greek, euangelion, like angel. Good, euangelion, news or message. And so what are Gospels? They are biographies. There were many ancient Gospels of Jesus, about Jesus. Only 4 were chosen. All of them are anonymous. None of them claim to be an eyewitness of the events they describe. In addition to that, we have 21 letters by Paul and by others, and these are great because very rarely do we have letters preserved. And letters give us not only big ideas, but also interesting views of just everyday life of the first Christians. In addition, we have a narrative of the origins of the Christian movement. That's the book of Acts, and that was written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. It's part 2 of Luke, not uncommon. It's a 2-volume Greco-Roman biography plus history. And lastly, we have what's called an apocalyptic text, Revelations. I'm not going to go into apocalypticism. I'm happy to do so in the question and answer period. It's a fascinating aspect of the early Christian and Jewish worldviews, but it will take us quite far astray because I'm so interested in it. New Testament texts, mostly written between the years 50 to 125 of our era by many different people over time, just like the Hebrew Bible. They focus on Jesus, Paul, and their followers. Roughly speaking, Jesus lived from 4 BCE to 30 CE. A little strange that he would have been born before Christ, but if you, according to the Gospel of Luke, he was born during the reign of Herod, and Herod died in 4 BCE, so that's why people make that argument. And Paul, roughly contemporary, 5 CE, little younger. Jesus seems not to have written anything, and Paul wrote many things. Paul's letters, interestingly, are earlier than the Gospels. Paul's letters, and I always have to think when I teach the New Testament, do I begin this course with the letters of Paul because they're earliest, or do I begin with the Gospels because they're earliest canonically? Remember that distinction between order and chronology? And so that's an interesting. So the earliest evidence we have from anywhere about about early Christianity is from the letters of Paul. With respect to the Gospels, the way to think about them I find helpful is to think about, say, 3 generations, roughly corresponding to the first, third, second third, and third third of the first century. I composed this in a Mac. I don't know what that is, but I'm not a PC person. Jesus lived in the first third of the first century. His immediate followers were in the second third. Neither Jesus nor his immediate followers, it seems, wrote anything. His immediate followers, his closest circle. And that came to the third generation. For example, the gospel writers, who lived in the third third, the last third of the first century. So that's a way to think about the layers. Remember that tell, a text is a tell? Well, here are 3 layers in the history of the earliest evidence with respect to the biographies of Jesus in the Gospels. And remember, they're all anonymous. None of them claim to be eyewitness. These were all new writings. But again, remember, it's an interesting, it seems obvious, but it's important to keep in mind. There was no New Testament when the New Testament was being written. Just like there was no Hebrew Bible when the Hebrew Bible was being written. We're talking about a group of people who had their scriptures already, namely the Hebrew Bible. But at a certain point, these new writings of theirs gained an equal authority, an equal status to the scriptures they had already had. And when does that happen? That's the second stage, after the first century, and beginning in that crucial second century for Christianity and the making of the New Testament. The second century is very important. During that time, and during the subsequent 2 centuries, we have 2 overlapping or competing tendencies. One was to collect as many different traditions about Jesus as possible, and the other was to select just a few that could be called scripture, that could be described as authoritative. This was a process of inclusion, therefore, and exclusion, and it was both literary and social, because what they would be doing would be collecting the writings of different communities and excluding the writings of other communities. There were many different ideas about who Jesus was. Was he fully God? Was he fully man? Was the emphasis on his teaching or on the significance of his death? There are many, many different ideas. And so at a certain point, some of those ideas represented in some texts produced by some communities were selected and some were excluded. And that is the canonization process, and it begins after the writings themselves in the second century and continuing for the next 2 centuries. And let me now just say a few words about this process. First, I remind you, there were many Gospels written, only 4 were selected. We have plenty of evidence for Gospels. I won't go through all of them, but we have some that are completely preserved, some that were partially preserved, some that are pieced together from quotes and little fragments of papyrus we find in the desert, mostly in Egypt. And then we have pieces of Gospels. We have Gospels that people mention, but we have no evidence for. That is to say, no evidence of the actual writings themselves. There are close to 100 such Gospels that we know of, and remember, only four were chosen. Let me pause for a second and point to the New Testament counterpart to the Dead Sea Scrolls, a discovery that was made in 1945 in Egypt in a place called Nag Hammadi. There we found 13 books of papyri, which included 52 works in the language called Coptic, that's Greek Egyptian, that were written in the 4th century, but that were simply copies of writings that were written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and maybe even earlier, a number of which were early Christian writings, including, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, for example. We knew about it, but we never had it. There, finally, we got it. A very important discovery. A number of these texts are what's called Gnostic. We can talk about that in the question and answer period as well. But this was a truly revolutionary discovery of equal importance for the New Testament to the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls for the Old Testament. By this time, we are not talking now about scrolls. We're talking about books. And you can see these are some of the earliest books. A book, another term for a book is a codex. A codex. It was actually the early Christians who really developed the book form, because by that time you had so many scriptures that it became unmanageable to collect them all in scrolls. And in the process of canonization, it made a lot of sense to start putting them in book form, in a codex form. So this is two of the 13 of the Nag Hammadi codices of early Christian writings. What is our first New Testament? Well, remember, there was no New Testament yet in the 1st century. There were New Testament writings, but they were not yet collected into an authoritative codex or canon. The first New Testament, it seems, comes from a very unexpected source, namely a man named Marcion in the 2nd century. Who is Marcion? Marcion is the archetypical heretic. He had ideas that were very much contrary to the ideas of what later became Orthodox Christianity. For example, Marcion believed that there were two gods, an evil demiurge of the Old Testament that created the evil world, and then a totally different new God of the New Testament. That Jesus was in no way a fulfillment of Jewish scriptures, but rather a new deity that would undo all of the bad stuff that came before. And he, therefore, would not have wanted to include, say, the Gospel of Matthew, which is so focused on Jesus as a fulfillment of Jewish scriptures. His New Testament was simply the Gospel of Luke and 10 letters of Paul, and that's it. That was Marcion's New Testament. The significance of this, we don't have this. The collection of Paul's letters he called the Apostolicon. The significance of this, we don't have, say, any manuscripts of this, is that it demanded a reaction for the first time. If no one did anything, then perhaps that would have been the New Testament. And this was a popular movement that he began, and the response to it came from a group of people who, in hindsight, we might call proto-Orthodox. For example, a contemporary named Irenaeus. He was a bishop in Lyon in France in the 2nd century. He responded to Marcion by offering a different canon. And in his response includes the first reference to 4 Gospels and not 1. Now, by that time, the canon is not fully closed, and there are other writings, including, for example, a book called The Shepherd of Hermas, or the first letter of Clement, which some people were still, his canon included it, later canons did as well. Ultimately, they were not included in the Western canons. So this is not the crystallization of the New Testament canon, but simply the earliest reference to 4 Gospels and a specific response to the canon of Marcion and to the ideas that it represented. An interesting quote from Ignatius, and here's a picture of Ignatius. "The Gospels could not possibly be either more or less in number than they are, since there are 4 zones in the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, while the church is spread over all the earth, and the pillar and foundation of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life. It fittingly has 4 pillars, everywhere breathing out incorruption and vivifying humans afresh." That incorruption, that would have been Marcion, for example. I think it's fascinating that they chose 4 Gospels and not 1. They're giving us a lot of credit here to try and figure things out for ourselves, because these are parallel and often different accounts of the same events. And it demands a real sophistication of faith, as it were. Not everyone was for the idea of 4 Gospels. Marcion, of course, was for 1. There was another early Christian writer, his name is Tatian, who also wanted 1 Gospel. But for him, he took all 4 and tried to weave them into 1. His book was called the Dia Tessaron. And you can see we have an early Arabic translation, and you can see that it begins with, say, the first lines of John, and then it goes to the first lines of Luke, and on and on. And this is also something that did not succeed in terms of canonization, but that was one of the many proposals put out in that crucial second century. Also, in the 2nd century and then into the 3rd and 4th, we have, for the first time, just lists of biblical books that were deemed authoritative. Perhaps the earliest one is called the Muratorian Canon, named after the Italian, 18th century Italian scholar who discovered it in a library. What is this? It's a fragment. It's a fragmentary description of authoritative books, maybe written in late 2nd century Rome, but maybe written in late 4th century Syria. These are the debates biblical scholars have. It includes 22 of the 27 canonical books. It's just often referred to as the earliest authoritative list of New Testament books. It does not include Hebrews, James, 1 and 2 Peter, or the 3rd letter of John. And as we move into the 3rd and 4th centuries, we get more and more of these lists. They all kind of differ, but we see in the 2nd and then 3rd, and especially the 4th, the crucial 4th century, the effort to finally crystallize this canon for now what is a movement that is becoming, say, 10% of the entire Roman Empire. And there really is now a need to select. Not only now, the collection has been done, now the selection process really needs to be confirmed. And the first confirmation, the first evidence we have of the 27 books of the New Testament canon that we have inherited, we find in the late 4th century writings of early Christian father named Athanasius, 367 CE, the first evidence we have of the 27-book canon of the New Testament that we know. Still, there was some debate. The closing of the canon, at least for the West, occurred in a series of synods or councils in North Africa, in Carthage, first in 394 and then finally in 419. This is the guiding hand of the great Olympian athlete of the Lord, Augustine, can be felt in the closing of the canon in these councils. But I want to emphasize that debate continued with respect to a number of books, including Revelation, one of the most significant books in American Christian culture, was very much debated in the canonization process. There was some resistance to it because of its intense apocalyptic imagery. And then a number of other writings too. And this debate continued, particularly in the East, in the Eastern churches. And so all those other books that were not included in this 27-book canon, we can call the New Testament Apocrypha. Just like you have the Old Testament Apocrypha, you also have the New Testament Apocrypha. What are these? Books early Christian writings that were not canonized. And you can go to the library and find them too. And you'll find many, many fascinating books that were not included in the New Testament canon, but that were written by the first Christians. The earliest Bibles, complete Bibles that we have, again, that crucial 4th century. Our evidence is primarily from 2 texts. One, the Codex or Books Sinaiticus, and then the Codex Vaticanus, named after the libraries in which they were housed. Both 4th century. This is the Codex Sinaiticus. And the significance here is that it was it was one codex that included both the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament and New Testament together now. If you're looking for the Book of Books, the earliest ones, these are they. The Codex Sinaiticus was found in the library of the monastery of St. Catherine's at the foot of Mount Sinai, which is another fascinating place to go. And if anyone, please let me know if you're going to trek over there. There is a monk in there. He looks like he's been in the desert for 40 years, but if you give him bananas, he'll show you manuscripts. It's true. It's true. So, generally speaking, from composition to canonization, Old Testament, New Testament, how can we give a kind of a simplified bird's eye view? Well, for the Old Testament, composition, first half of the first millennium BCE, canonization, second half. For the New Testament, composition, first half, composition, first century CE, canonization, second century CE. Now we can complexify that. Some New Testament writings, for example, the Gospel of John and some other letters, Titus, they were written in the 2nd century. And the canonization process really went from the 2nd through the 4th century. And in some ways, never stopped, even through the Reformation, of course. But that's a kind of a schematic way to think about it in terms of halves. You know? Just a few final words and thoughts. Some interesting demographic figures here in terms of the emergence of Christianity as a social movement and a new religion. If we point to, say, the moment of Jesus' death, people don't know exactly when, year 30, maybe 33. We're talking maybe about 20 to 100 original followers of Jesus. Going now into the 4th decade, maybe that widens to around 1,000. And we could look at the evidence of, say, Paul's letters and the communities that he speaks with for this. By the end of the century, we might be speaking of several thousand Christians throughout the Mediterranean. And by the year 300, 5 million Christians, or 10% of the population. That's what we call exponential growth. X equals y squared. It really does follow that curve. In other words, the exponential growth means that the more people, the sharper the curve. You see how that works? So needless to say, you can see where the need for a Christian canon became acutely necessary, and that is in the 300s, when you had such a large movement and such a variety of literary texts and ideas that there needed to be some effort to cohere this new movement, lest it dissipate into many, many different movements. And so in that respect, the shaping of Scripture kind of parallels the shaping of the communities that produced them. Every biblical book represents the community that composed it, and also the community or the individuals that selected this book and not other books. And this is the case for early Christian communities throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa. And some final words with respect to the significance of the making of the Book of Books. First, with respect to ancient Judaism, and second, with respect to early Christianity. Ancient Judaism can be described as a movement from temple to text, meaning that what was religion in the ancient Near Eastern world, like ancient Israel and Judah, ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt? Religion was temple cult, and cult in the Latin sense of cultus deorum, care of the gods. Religion was not a matter of necessarily belief or interpretation of doctrine. It was a matter of going to temples and participating in sacrificial rites to particular deities through, for example, the burning of meat or offerings of grain, or also offerings of prayer. The idea was that a particular god or goddess lived in a particular place called a temple. And in order to keep the god or goddess there, human beings had to maintain that temple and make sacrifices to the deity. Now, what happens when you, say, no longer have a temple, as was the case when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem in 586? Well, suddenly, that was a huge challenge. And interestingly, the response was the making of biblical books. These books often tell us all about how to sacrifice to a god in the temple, but they're not necessarily doing that at that time. What happens is, in the beginnings of Judaism, we can call it a process of the textualization of religion, where you have a shift from a temple religion to a book religion. It begins in that period from, say, the 5th, 4th, 2nd, 3rd centuries, and ultimately it leads to, for example, ancient Jewish synagogues, where unlike the Jewish Jerusalem temple in Jerusalem, these were synagogues, communal houses of worship. Synagoge is a Greek word to bring together or lead together, where they were not sacrificing to a deity, they were interpreting a book. Now, where was that book placed? It was placed in the innermost kind of sanctuary of the synagogue. In other words, in the same place where in the ancient Near Eastern temples, the god would have been, or the goddess, normally in a statue form. This is a synagogue from 3rd century Syria called Dura Europos, right on the Euphrates border of the Rock. And you can see this is what's called an ark, and in it you would have had scrolls, book scrolls. So the beginnings of book religion can be found in this transition in ancient Judaism from temple to text. Similarly, with Christianity, I've already alluded to the fact that early Christians were really the ones who gave us the book form. And that is because by that time, the effort to codify by that time, already textualized religion became almost unmanageable if you still referred to just scrolls. And so it was the early Christians who then created the book, and ultimately the book that we know, the book of books, the Bible. So that's a very significant development, both with respect to Judaism and Christianity, that ultimately gave us the book religions that we know. The book religions that we know. And in that light, we can think of the production of books as stages of inspiration, meaning I've described a number of stages, say, from composition to canonization, from the moment when books were created to then the moment when books were authorized and canonized into Holy Writ. And then finally into the last stage where these books are no longer being newly created, they are already written and already canonized. So where is the inspiration? The inspiration we know with respect to authorship, that is inspired authorship, similarly inspired selection of particular books, right? But then at the end of the day, it belongs for us and for everyone after the canonization process closed in the realm of interpretation, in what these books mean. And so that process began at the very beginning of the composition and canonization process. Remember, Josiah and then Ezra read with interpretation. But ultimately, the realm of inspiration for book religions after those books were finished lies in the realm of biblical interpretation. That's where inspiration lies for us today after the Book of Books has been closed. Now, having said having said what I said about the past of the Bible, let me just say a few words about the potential future of the Bible in this age of Kindles and what is the Apple product? Slab or something? What is it? The iPad. Okay, I don't know why I thought. Yeah, I'm not advertising for Apple by any means here. People are then asking questions like, well, does this signify the end of the book? And therefore, perhaps the end of the book of books? This would be a sad day for the first printed book, the Bible. But in this respect, I encourage you to recall that observation that we learned with respect to the Dead Sea Scrolls, namely the pluriformity of both the world that produced the Bible and the Bible itself in its very beginnings, where you had, say, many different forms of many different books representing many different possible perceptions and interpretations and possibilities. And this pluriformity lends itself quite organically to the digital form in a way. So perhaps the new media does not herald the end of the book of books, but on the contrary, just like the Bible heralded the creation of the codex, the book form, it might also breathe actual new life into the digital form. And so in that respect, the book of books may live on as the book of life, as a living testament to the human communities who shared in its making and who came to be through its coming to be. And with that, I'll close and be very happy to start a conversation. So thank you very much.
I think some people are going to come and pick up some microphones.
You described all the pluralizations that have gone on in the selections and so on. Would you say that the Bible sort of underwent a process of natural selection?
Natural selection.
Or
Well,
natural editing or choices?
I would say that the individuals and groups of individuals who created the book of books, who selected these books, made their decisions based on some very careful considerations. I resist kind of evolutionary arguments about the development of human culture per se, but what did they do? What were they doing when they were selecting particular books and not others? Well, they were selecting those books that they felt best represented the strongest traditions and the most powerful and well-represented traditions. In other words, by choosing 4 Gospels, they could have just chose one, but what would that have done? That would have made that one group who adhered, who promoted that one Gospel very happy, but it would have alienated all the others, and so that might have made the movement, that might have weakened it, if you want to use the evolutionary term. But by choosing 4, they appealed to a range of different communities. So for example, by choosing Matthew, they appealed to early Christians who were rooted very much in Jewish traditions. And by choosing Luke, they were appealing to early Christian groups who were very much rooted in Greco-Roman culture. And with John, maybe some more Gnostic tendencies. And Mark, well, that was a very early gospel, a very challenging, difficult, and short, but early gospel. And so the decision for which books to choose was based on ultimately how to strengthen and cohere this movement. So in that way, yeah, I would say there was a certain natural selection, but it was not unconsciously done. It was not inevitable. It was the decision of human beings. This is the tradition itself is very clear about this. These books were written by human beings and selected by human beings, but they did their work very well. Very well, yes.
How about down here?
Thank you for the lecture. Just to follow on that, one of the elements of this whole topic is there has been continuing scholarship in addition to interpretation. We have collected, as you said, more of the ancient texts that were not available.
Right.
And it gave rise, to, in my mind, to the question, if the Council of Carthage, or those that created the canon, knew then what we knew now, might they have selected differently?
I hate to answer your question with a question, but wait, do you mean what? Like what? Like new? What do we know now that might, for example?
Well, we've had
In terms of the number of other gospels that we know about?
we've had 1,700 years of experience under that canon, and we've had a lot of human history has transpired since then. Knowing what we know was available at that time, if there were a new council today, might the council pick another canon?
Yeah, might they have picked? Well, that was very much a possibility. There are all sorts of stories about these councils, including opposing groups sending out people to meet their opposition on the way and kind of give them a hard time or even kill them. So it's hard to say what would have been had, say, the Gospel of Thomas been included and not the Gospel of Mark. It's unclear. I mean, the more they could have included, the more possibilities you might say it could have led to. But one possibility would have been they would have included so much that the movement would have just become incoherent or dissipate. And so I don't know. Historical possibilities of this sort are hard to imagine, but I like imagining these possibilities. It's important because we can't assume that what was what necessarily had to be. Had they picked, well, that was one of the concerns about Revelations, that it's kind of violent imagery. There was some concern that wasn't a helpful message. It wasn't going to appeal to the Roman authorities. It might lead to suppression or forms of insurgency. There are a limitless range of possibilities. So I'm sure that a given text could have led its later interpreters to create different social forms and do different things in the world. But that's really, I would say, a matter not of the texts themselves, but of the people who read them and what they do based on the way they choose to interpret them. And so there are as many different interpretations of a given text as there are interpreters. And that wouldn't matter. That wouldn't be any different whether we're talking about the Gospel of Bartholomew or the Gospel of Matthew. And so I really would say it's not the book, but the people who read it who lead to other possibilities, I would say, yeah.
When did the concept of Jesus as God, the deification of Jesus, come into being? What time frame?
From the very beginning, it was not a unique idea that a human being could be a god. Greco-Roman culture was replete with semi-divine beings. The emperor was one of them. Alexander the Great, Augustus, Julius Caesar. So this wasn't a new idea. What do we do? We look at our evidence. Well, our earliest gospel, Mark, focuses on a very human Jesus, although also the Messiah. Our latest gospel, at least canonical gospel, John, has a Jesus who is, yes, human, but also very, very divine as well. The Logos, and then when we look at non-canonical Gospels, we see some that represent Jesus as 100% divine. That's a movement called Docetism, and from the Latin doceo, to seem. Jesus only seemed human, but he was in fact fully a god. Marcion was a Docicist, for example. Marcion was the 2nd century. So really from the late 1st century on, we have this conversation going on among the followers of Jesus about whether he was fully God or fully man or half God and half human or both. And so that idea is we see in the very beginning.
Well, when was the Trinity sort of conceptualized and codified, or made sort of solid.
Right. That happened in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. Those are the crucial centuries where these early distinctions among doctrine are worked out, and these ideas are never fully resolved. But for the Orthodox groups who eventually inherited the power, they this was a process that again was very much at work in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries, but then in the 4th century in particular, it became codified. Okay. But really, I would say the answer to your question is 2nd century is the beginning of that. 2nd century. It's not the beginning of the ideas, the beginning of the effort to cohere those ideas, the Trinity being one. There are some texts in, say, the Gospel of John that refer to the Trinity that were added by later, that were not, say, in the earliest manuscripts of John, but that were added later as this process continued. So, yeah.
I was surprised by how few followers Jesus had at his death. Were there rival prophets or gospels about other prophets that were under consideration at this time of early writings?
Yes, very much so. This was a very turbulent time in 1st century Judea, and you had a number of individuals who would claim to be, or who others would claim they were, deliverers of some sort. And there were many different kinds of deliverers. There could be, say, leaders of military insurgencies. There could be individuals who were understood to have to be fulfillments of Jewish prophetic messianic scriptures. The Dead Sea Scrolls community, for example, contemporary, roughly, had they had actually 2 messiahs. They had one who was a priestly messiah and one who was a royal messiah, a messiah of Aaron and a messiah of David. And their teacher, the teacher of righteousness, was, they called the teacher of righteousness, as opposed to their enemy, the wicked priest in Jerusalem, the teacher of righteousness. They understood to be prophetically inspired, who understood the Israelite prophets better than the prophets themselves. And there were many of John the Baptist. You'll see that if you read carefully, the Gospels are kind of the Gospel writers were at pains to kind of explain why Jesus would have been baptized by John the Baptist. Why would John the Baptist baptize Jesus? Jesus being the one whom John the Baptist is predicting. So it seems that Jesus was a follower of John the Baptist. He would have been maybe one. In early Jewish literature, there was one figure called Bar Kokhba. He was in the 2nd century. He was understood to be a messiah. He led a violent insurgency against Rome, which failed spectacularly. His original name was Bar Kosiba, but he changed his name to Bar Kokhba, literally the son of a star. Think Star of Bethlehem. Both the New Testament writers with respect to Jesus and the followers of Bar Kokhba understood him as a prophetic fulfillment based on the oracle in Numbers 24:17. A star shall rise out of Jacob and a scepter, and so there were many competing figures who could be understood and who understood as messianic deliverers of one sort or another, and the Roman authorities knew. It seems they were ready. They were not surprised when another Jewish prophet who spoke of, say, a kingdom of God came before them. It seems like they had plenty of experience controlling this threat to the Roman peace, and so yes, Jesus was not the only figure of that time who people ascribed messianic power and possibility to. The difference came, of course, in the subsequent centuries, and his followers, and the strength of this movement, whereas the other movements died away, most of them with the Roman destruction of Judea in 70, and the rest of them with the Roman destruction of all of the Judean countryside in 135 after that Bar Kokhba revolt. So, yes.
I have a question. I think, if my memory is right, that the Protestant Reformation began in something like 1517, and about 8 or 9 years later, scholars at Oxford who had learned Greek and Hebrew and Coptic, I suppose, made fresh translations. They didn't use the Catholic Bible, the Latin Vulgate Bible, to do that. They started fresh. So how did they decide, given all the information you presented tonight, what to include in this new Protestant Bible, and how are they sure that this was a better Bible than the one the church was using?
Well, that's a good question. That would be Jerome's Vulgate or Latin Bible. This was so. What we're talking about is the Protestant call back to the sources, back to Scripture, and their challenge was simply to peel away the centuries of Catholic tradition to get back to the source. Now, the closer they got to the source, the closer they got to the New Testament, to the four Gospels that were originally chosen in the 2nd century. What would have happened if they continued that process? All right, because what are the Gospels, even the 4 canonical Gospels? They are representations, interpretations of the life, teaching, death of Jesus. But they are, again, part of that tradition itself. They are not the source. The source, what would be the source? Ultimately, that would be what you call the kernel, the kerygma in Greek, the preaching of Jesus himself. That source is lost in centuries of interpretation, beginning with the gospel authors themselves. But what happens is when you keep peeling those layers away, one after another, like an onion, the risk is that you end up with nothing in the center, because the center is obscured, because Jesus never wrote anything, and nor did his immediate followers. So they had to stop somewhere. And where they stopped were with the Gospels that were chosen by the proto-Orthodox Christians, and those Gospels were chosen for specific reasons. One of those reasons is because they're the oldest. Another reason is because of the way they preserve a couple of different interpretations of Jesus' life, teaching, and death. And so you might ask, why did they not then just choose one of them? Or why didn't they choose any of them? At this university, at the University of Montana, there was something that still goes on elsewhere now, but for years it was called the Jesus Seminar. Has anyone heard of this? So scholars from around the world would come here, and they would sit down with the canonical Gospels and try and determine which sayings of Jesus were original, which were his. And they would kind of highlight those in red, and then the ones that they're not quite sure, did Jesus say this, or is this Luke saying that Jesus said this? Not quite sure, those would be in gray. And then definitely Luke, an interpreter of Jesus, that's black. And so you have this red letter edition. And that happened here, very famous conference every year. But that's a tricky, a very hard thing to do, to find the original message. So the Protestant quest was a fine line between returning to the source and returning, and yet keeping some New Testament you cannot ultimately go behind the authors of the New Testament completely, because that's all we have, our evidence from the 1st and 2nd century, and our New Testament texts are really the oldest evidence. And so, it's a fine line. They had to stop somewhere. It's an excellent question. It's a very interesting question.
And I'm gonna
yeah.
say it's gonna be the last question.
question.
But
All right.
because I know some people have to be out of here, but if you would like to stay, if you have more questions, I think Professor Levtow would take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.